because literally spent my whole life wanting to be loved. And I didn't even have that awareness every step, every decade of my life, at 60 years old, I was like, damn, my whole life has been this drive to be loved. Most of my decisions were organized around this missing piece for me as a kid, wanting their parent to love them, because every kid wants that, even if your parents are toxic. We want to be loved. So it was so powerful to see the way my whole life was organized around that.
Frank, welcome to Discover More.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be here.
So I'm curious, Frank, did you ever get a big balloon from your mom?
It's a great question. No, nobody's asked me that. That's awesome. No, the balloon never happened. We never got the big balloon, but we talk about it frequently. There's the offer and the pullback, So no, that's great.
I bring that up because, as you know, when we have a lot of trauma and depression, it tends to distort our memories. And we sometimes forget the happy moments we share, especially given our family trauma. So I wanted to really emphasize and bring forward where even with trauma, even with sadness, there are sprinkles and cocktails of happiness and joy that we often forget.
It was one of the things that was so surprising as I wrote the memoir. Yes, we encode negative memories much more potently than we encode positive memories. But as I was writing this memoir, I was like, wait a minute. There was a lot of joy and laughter here too, because yes, we totally encode the negative more than the positive. So it was useful for me to hold those fun, positive memories also, but still no balloon.
So speaking of mixed memories and mixed emotions, I'm curious, how is your relationship with anger today?
My relationship with anger is so much different than it's been. And this is even within the last 2 years, honestly. Most of my life, I have been so anger phobic, nice, kind to a fault, because I was so afraid of anger. Mostly because of my dad's out of control anger and rage, verbally and physically, right? So I went the other way. I was like, get me out of here. I don't want to deal with anger at all. And interestingly enough, through my dad's passing and mostly through my oldest son, who is 20 years old now and has a very similar dynamic as my father, transgenerationally, no surprise, really holds anger, right? Anger is his primary defense. I have learned to be with anger in a way that's not terrifying and scary to me anymore. And that's been huge for me in my life. Not be non-reactive and to tolerate it in a way that allows for the feelings, but still allows me to maintain a boundary. So it's been a huge transformation for me, one of the biggest.
I think that's an interesting dichotomy because you and your oldest son or your dad, your upbringing made you a conflict avoidance. And I know that's one of the big things that you and Michael had to work through, your current husband, but also for your son and your dad, anger is your primary coping. I want to go into conflict avoidance why is that not necessarily a good thing?
It's so interesting because, I felt in the middle, like there's me as a son with my dad in a lifelong history of his anger, being the recipient of that. Then as my son grows up, even though I'm in the parental position, I felt like here I am again with this kid who primarily is anger driven in that kind of typical male pattern way. So I really felt stuck in the middle. I really did. It was really interesting. It's like, oh my goodness, now I'm the parent, and yet I am holding this conflict avoidant pattern. So it was really interesting to be sandwiched in between. But what I will tell you that I've learned with my son is the conflict avoidance didn't help him at all learn how to manage and regulate his own emotions. So my taking that back seat only perpetuated the problem for him. And he even said to me in one point, why have you never been able to help me with my feelings? I was like, damn, that really hit hard. Because like my conflict avoidance made it difficult for me to help my son regulate his own emotions, even though, again, I was sandwiched in between these two angry men.
I want to go into parenting since you brought it up. Could you explain to us that what is parentification and what is the hidden cost to children are forced to parentify out of necessity, out of family trauma?
Parentification is something that I'm going to say most therapists suffer from. I hate to say that so bluntly, but the reality is you don't become a caretaker for no reason. You don't become the parent of everyone around you for no reason. And there's a couple things. It's an adaptation. When parents are out of control, when the people who are supposed to be in charge aren't, for one way or another, and I had this combination. I had a parent who was angry and volatile and attacking, and I had the other parent who was passive and accommodating. So nobody held parental power for me growing up. So in families, kids take on the roles that are needed, the empty roles, if you will. So I jumped in as the oldest child and took on that parentification. Honestly, I parented my mother and I parented my siblings, right? I wasn't parenting my father, but I jumped in to take care of them because that role wasn't there. My dad was too out of control. My mom was too passive. We typically use that, though, as protection, self-protection, which people aren't really aware of. If I make sure everyone else is okay, then maybe I will be taken care of. So this parentification becomes an adaptation, honestly, that isn't super effective, but it's necessary in the moment, right? And then what you end up doing is you become an adult who takes care of everyone and your needs are neglected. So I worked hard at trying to reverse that role that was necessary at the time, but no longer serves in the long run.
I think it's interesting because, like you said, you're parentified, you're a caregiver for so many, and now you're in a helping profession. And your incessant, this bottomless pit of needs to feel validated and be seen by your father was not quite fulfilled until the funeral or the 3 weeks before the funeral during your second to last visit. And I think that's the irony where you're giving, 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 but who is giving it and where is your receiving?
Oh my goodness. Receiving is so hard for me. And really, when I kind of when you write a book, the title is kind of everything in a way. And the title of To Be Loved was just like this direct hit. I knew in the instant, like, oh my goodness, that is the title to this book, because literally spent my whole life wanting to be loved. And I didn't even have that awareness every step, every decade of my life, at 60 years old, I was like, damn, my whole life has been this drive to be loved. Most of my decisions were organized around this missing piece for me as a kid, wanting their parent to love them, because every kid wants that, even if your parents are toxic. We want to be loved. So it was so powerful to see the way my whole life was organized around that. And honestly, I'm an open book, as if you've read the book. And right now, my husband and I are in couples therapy. We both have very similar history, no surprise. And we're working on getting our needs met. Like, this is such a basic thing, but here we are. After being together for 25 years, we are working. Hey, I matter. Hey, how can I show up? How can I get my needs met more directly instead of indirectly? So it's shocking to me. And I'm a damn therapist, and I do this for a living, and it's still hard.
I want to zoom in on, you said that I'm a therapist and a psychiatrist, and this is still damn hard. I think we as helpers often forget, because we understand the theory, we understand the studies, the literature, the clinical experience. We tend to over-rationalize, right, and sexualize our problems. And then I feel like that manifests and spills over to our surprises often.
It drove me crazy honestly. And what I'm talking about here is the way I replicated some of this behavior of my father's with my sons. Okay. It drove me crazy, really. It was like, I am a Harvard trained psychiatrist. I know the theory. I teach the theory all over the world. I help people with this. I run workshops. I know how to do this, and I help many people in their journeys. And yet, here I am struggling with it and replicating it. Like, really, it was unbelievable. I had such a strong critic in me. My husband would say, "You are way too hard on yourself." I'm like, "You don't understand. I know what's right. I do this I read my first or second book. Like, I've written about this." So you become this world expert, and yet you still have these patterns kind of ingrained in you, in implicit memory. They're automatic responses. And even though I knew it, knowledge and awareness does not change what's kind of in our souls, in our bodies, in our nervous system. And that was so frustrating. I write about this, it was the places in my life where I was suicidal, honestly, is when I did what was done to me was so intolerable that those were the moments I was suicidal. I'm so grateful I don't hold that level of criticism to my faulty human behavior anymore. I have the space to allow myself to be human without the strong criticism, and to understand, like, yeah, we are all the same here, and we're all good and we're all bad. We all help and we all don't help. So it's been a huge relief for me to not know what's right, fail, but also not be super critical.
I often tell my clients that only two types of people are perfect and flawless. One is Jesus Christ, shout out. And the second is people who are dead.
Yeah.
Right? It's true. And no one can dispute that.
And we are too hung up on being right. More importantly, as I learned recently, it's even more important for us to make the other wrong. And the reason I say that is this. It's one thing for I've got to be right. I'm defensive, whether I'm self-critical or hold this high standard. Making the other wrong allows us to not focus on our faults. We push our wrong onto the other side. This is what's happening in our political system right now as we speak. It's so what we call polarized, right? So this right-wrong thing is so toxic for human beings. It's toxic for culture. I think the more we can hold the and in every one of us, the better off we're going to be as a culture and a society. And it was really important to me in writing this book to show my fallibility just as much as my successes. It's like, I learned that. I learned it the hard way.
I think I'm a former policymaker, actually. So I know policies and politics really well, but I got jaded and now I'm allergic to it. But one quick comment on that is, I think the framework of right and wrong gives us an illusion of control. As you know,
100%.
Anger is often secondary emotions and fear is a primary. And a lot of people don't want to admit being angry feels good. It empowers you, air quote, for the moment by exerting, I'm right, you're wrong, and I feel like I have this modicum of control for that moment. But it's an illusion. It's not real.
We're all both. And until we acknowledge that and we split it off, what ends up happening is we keep re-perpetuating the problem. This is why that solution never ends as a resolution, because it keeps perpetuating it, and until we can hold both within all of us, we're going to be in trouble. This is one of my biggest missions in my life right now, is to hold the complexity of all human beings. You know, there was this moment in the book where my neighbor, Mr. O'Connell, came over to the house when my dad was dying and was so proud of himself being at the insurrection, right? And me as a gay guy, it's like, okay, maybe we're at opposite sides of this pole here. But, right, I was always afraid of him growing up. I always had fear of him. But we bonded around our trauma histories. Like I wrote this book, Transcending Trauma. He asked me questions. I told him about my trauma history. He told me about his. And we were connected around both of us growing up with abusive fathers. When he knew my dad, he was his neighbor forever. But he was able to identify with me, and I was able to relate to him. You know, like we both have been through something horrific. He hugged me. He wanted me to sign the book. We joined together in our commonality without this push for separateness and othering. It's huge. And to this day, when I go home to see my mom, he is happy to see me, and we are connected in a way that more of us need to do, in my opinion.
I want to jump to the end of the book, speaking of your neighbor. My favorite passage from your book, Frank, is this. Liz, sweetheart, honestly, I wasn't running away from you. I was running toward me. Speaking of holding both, after your painful divorce with your then wife and best friends, Frank, how do we then return to our disconnected selves?
I love that you said that's your favorite line in the book. Somebody I know tattooed it on their forearm. You want to talk about having impact? I've got a picture of this reader who's like, oh my goodness, you have changed my life. He asked for permission. Is it okay if I get that line tattooed on my forearm? I was like, are you kidding me? Like, what better honor than that is to have that line tattooed permanently on somebody's arm. So that was a huge moment for me. This place of, like coming to me as opposed to running from her, right? It's happened twice in my life, I'll tell you, significantly. One was the moment when I was 32 and I chose me over everyone else. Because let me tell you, growing up in a conservative family in that way in the Midwest, I knew I would lose my whole family if I came out. Like gay was, I didn't even know what gay was. And I certainly knew that gay was bad and wrong. They had horrible things to say about gay people. So I heard that stuff growing up. So I was certain that I would lose everything if I came out, which is one of the reasons I chose the other over me for most of my life. So in that moment at 32, I was driving to work and literally the I am gay hit me so powerfully that I couldn't breathe and I had to pull over at the side of the road. It really was a moment. I'll never forget it. It was so physiologic, the reality that I could no longer run away from. I couldn't. It's like, this is me. And really, it was a physical reaction and I pulled over. And I was like, there's no going back now. And I have to choose me over everyone else. And I was prepared to lose. I told my brother first. I told my parents 2 years later. This is how fearful it was for me. And it was liberating. It was liberating to finally have me be chose over anyone else. It was like, I don't care anymore. I'm too exhausted to hold you over me. It was just too much energy. And so it was very liberating, and it turned out better than I thought it did, honestly. Second time was writing this book. This is the second time in my life because I knew my mother would be horrified by what I wrote because I wrote the truth in a way that both my mom and dad denied for most of their life. And I thought, here we go again, Frank. You're choosing you, I would say. And I said, I'm choosing Frankie over anyone and everyone. And I did, and it has been a bumpy road. It has not been smooth. But I got to a point in my life that I am more important than anyone else. Finally, not in a narcissistic, egomaniac way, in an honoring me too. I have to honor myself above everyone else. You know the cliche, you got to love yourself before you love everyone else? It ain't no cliche. It's actually true. And I've done it twice in my life. And it feels really good. Really, really good.
I think a hallmark of a great conversation is my brain gets split into 14 different directions.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll try to stay collective, but I have a few follow-up questions.
Yes.
The first one is, you alluded to this just now. What's the hidden cost of conformity by being air quote normal?
Yes, that's exactly right. Well, I can tell you, 32 years worth of normal, and the one of the chapters is made it to normal, right? And it's really true. I worked so hard. I was vigilant, I was smart and a quick learner. So I would watch everyone to see how I was supposed to be acceptable. I played baseball. I watched my uncles. I looked at their mannerisms. I looked at their behavior. I watched my brother. I looked at my dad. It's like, this is what people want of me. Who cares who I am? Throw it out. This is the way you're going to get loved and accepted. So the cost, honestly, of organizing your whole life around being what you believe people want you to be and what people actually told you to be honest, was I was totally cut off from any of my emotion. I had no access to feelings, my own. I really didn't. I was in therapy when I was in my residency, 5 times a week for 11 years, never shed a tear.
Shout out to Mike Frost.
Yeah, an amazing guy, an amazing person, lovely, kind person, and I never cried once. How are you in therapy for 5 times a week for 11 years and never shed a tear? Because I had no access to the deeper layer of my emotions, none, And now, that is the biggest gift, is that I am an emotional being. I have feelings and I can feel them and I can honor them. And that is huge for me, honestly. That's like saving the soul. That's what it feels like to me. Now my youngest son, Brett, who's on the spectrum, him and I watch movies together. And he's watching me because he struggles as a young kid with emotion regulation because of the overwhelm of being autistic, right? And he's watching me. Crying yet, Papa? Are you crying yet, Papa? Like he's trying to learn about his emotions through watching me. And I cry now. You're always crying. I say, yep. And you know how much money that cost me? You know how many years in therapy I've been in to be able to cry? I really am. It's like, I love the fact that I can feel the normal range of emotions. It's huge for me, honestly.
That reminds me of another quote from your book where you said that you're a scientist, you're scientifically trained, you always revere the discipline of STEM and science. But through this experience, you also said you finally recognized the functionality and the roles of emotions in your life.
Yeah, huge. Absolutely. Like, it's great that I'm smart, and smart has been helpful for me. I like getting to the origin of things. I like understanding things. I like the scientific process. It's nice to know what something is when you can deeply study it in that way. So there's value to that, but not at the expense of being a human being with a heart. Like now I have both. I actually have a head and a heart. Because one of the things that I think is important for people to understand is that you really don't lose your smart if you're going to heal your trauma. You have access to your smart without having it be the only option. Now it's a choice versus the only option. So I have a heart. I've always had a heart. I just had no access to it. Let's put it that way, right? But now I have access to both in a way that feels really, really good. It feels very integrated. Some people are all emotion. They cry at the drop of a hat and they're so overwhelmed they can't function in relationship. Like that's an option too for some people. I was all head, no heart. We're all both. And now I have access to both in a way that's like so important. I mean, people knew it about me, but I never really showed it. I think they felt it, but I never was able to feel it myself or show it to people, honestly.
I want to go into Mike Frost, your first therapist that you just talked about. He told you in one of your sessions that sitting with people in pain often activates the hidden pain within ourselves. Why is that?
I teach about this. Speaking of head, there's this body of research talking about empathy versus compassion. Tanya Singer, who's the neuroscientist who's done some of the work around this, because different people have different views about it. Empathy is when we resonate with somebody else's pain. So when we're sitting with somebody, we're feeling ours while they're feeling theirs. People always confuse it. They think, oh, you're sad, I'm feeling your sadness. No, actually, it's I'm resonating with your sadness, but I'm feeling mine while you're feeling yours. And that's an important distinction from my perspective, because that resonating is like tapping into the emotion. We don't have the same direct experience as the person, but we're resonating with the emotion. And that is super important. And that is a huge piece of connecting with people. And as therapists, when we feel something, we're feeling our history in the midst of being with somebody in their history. Super important to be able to do that. It's one of the main ways we connect. It's why music and movies and art are so important. It's because there's a resonating with it, right? So that's important. But if we only feel it, we get overwhelmed. We need compassion too. We need the capacity to hold space for somebody else. She calls it theory of mind. Like, do you have the capacity to step outside of yourself and be in somebody else's shoes? Also super important, right? So it's one of those and things. We need to be able to feel it, and we need to be able to hold space for somebody else's, right? That is what connection and relationship is about. So I don't think we're great at doing both, moving in and out of feeling it without being overwhelmed, being with it and holding space for the horrific. When you sit, this is one of the things, as wonderful as Mike was, and he is a truly kind human being. There was a moment that I felt he doesn't know what this pain is like. He didn't feel it, and I don't feel him feeling with me, right? And again, I love him. He is a kind human being, but he couldn't resonate with the degree of pain I was in. Again, doesn't have to have the same experience, but I knew he didn't get the depths of my pain. And so I didn't feel ultimately safe enough to go there with him. Healing is about not only the knowledge and the tools and knowing the techniques. It's about, does this person get the depth of pain? And can they help me through it? And I think that's huge. I don't think we talk about that in the therapy world. Is like, yeah, you have the theory, but do you have the experience to bring somebody through their pain?
One of the first things that we're taught in grad school, doctorates, whatever, is our primary role is to bear witness to the pain and the journey of others. But if you dig deeper, bearing witness requires understanding and resonance, which is what you're talking about.
Nobody talks about that a lot. Is the resonance is really key. If you're going to work in trauma, and you can't be a therapist without seeing people with trauma histories, because it's everywhere. You've got to be able to be willing to go there yourself in order to help somebody else. right? And the paradox is that most therapists go into it so they can focus on somebody else's instead of their self. You know what I mean? So I'm teaching people all the time, like, if you're going to do this, you have to go there within yourself. Don't expect your capacity to be with somebody else as being enough if you're not willing to feel it, which is why we have to do our own work, because we have to not be overwhelmed by our own, but we have to have the capacity to be with our horrific pain in order to truly be with, resonate somebody else in their pain. I worked with somebody recently and he just was so devastated. He grew up in a cult, a religious cult. And I started feeling, and I worked with him for 8-10 years, and he was so guarded, so guarded, so guarded. He finally got there. And I was so confident. I was like, I know this pain. Not the experience, not the pain. I'm like, I've got this, and I could be there with him through this. I know it. And he felt that confidence in me. And it enabled him to move through it because he knew I had his back, not cognitively, emotionally. Super important.
And there is a fundamental difference, I guess, going there with them and your willingness to dive deep into the emotional bottomless pit versus taking ownership.
Taking ownership or rescuing.
Mm-hmm. Because as you talked about in the book, that people call us wounded healers for a reason. Because so many of us, like you said, we're using this avoidance tendency to avoid our problems by externally seeking this avenue of helping. And we like to pride ourselves by taking ownership of their successes and failures. But you're the coach. The way I think of, I'm a very visual thinker. We're like the coaches standing outside of the boxing ring. We're one of many. We're yelling at them. We're giving them feedback, not advice. But they're the ones taking punches in the ring. The hardships in their life, we glimpse into their hardships, but we are not living their life. So we can't take ownership. They take ownership. They earned it, but we get to bear witness and resonate with their journey.
100%. And what healing is in trauma is not interpretations or great advice that people internalize. That is not what healing is. Healing is help, exactly what you're talking about, helping somebody else regain capacity of their own life, because trauma violates that. Trauma is a violation of one's self. Our job is to empower somebody back into ownership. I'm going to give you this great interpretation or this great information that's going to help you change your life. I'm going to give you, somebody said to me recently who I was working with, they're like, Frank, you gave me back to me. I have me now. And she's crying and she's like, I have myself back. I can't thank you enough. You have changed my life. And it was such a beautiful statement. And I knew it was true. It's not like my great wisdom helped her heal her trauma. No way. She's so grateful because I gave her back to her. So she's like, I can go anywhere now and I have me now, because trauma does disconnect us from ourself. That's what it is at its core. It's a disconnection of self to parts. And when she said, you gave me back to me, I was like, she's good to go, because now she has herself wherever she goes in a way that she didn't. Same thing that I was saying about me earlier. I had no me as I was navigating my life because I was so disconnected. I have me now too, and I can navigate differently because I'm in the discussion, because I'm in the ring, no matter what opponent shows up. I have me. And that's what we give people in trauma healing, the connection to their authentic selves back.
So here's $1 million questions. Why isn't our trauma our identities, Frank?
Trauma is what we carry. Trauma energy is a negative interaction that we absorb. It's not who we are. And part of the job of healing is to help somebody release the energy that they absorbed as a result of a traumatic interaction or experience. So it's like, let's get rid of the energy that your body, your system absorbed as a result of the fight, the car accident, the loss, the violation. It's an energy we store. We are sponges, okay? It's not who we are, it's what we carry. That's a very important distinction. And I'll tell you, I just was on a call this week with a scientist who I love, Ruth Lanius. She's so powerful. She's from Ontario, Canada. She does some amazing work. She showed us a study, which is new information of how trauma and the sense of self get linked in the brain. Literally, the periaductal gray, which is a structure in the brain that encodes raw emotional experiences, gets linked to the default mode network, which is a part of the brain that has self-awareness and self-identification. And Ruth showed how the periaductal gray and the default mode network get linked in trauma, and people say, I am my trauma. And this is me. Because most people identify with it because it's so overwhelming, it takes over our identity and sense of self. And Ruth is like, well, here's the science that shows how it happens. And trauma therapy is about uncoupling the default mode network with the periaqueductal gray. And it's true. And that's what I can tell you. The more trauma energy I release, the more me I become. The me before my trauma is the way I say it. And it's true. It's true. I'm more me than I've ever been in my life.
That actually reminds me of my interview with James Ardotti. He's a neuroscientist from Stanford. And he talks about one of the default brain networks, the Salient Network, where your brain picks up subconsciously what is salient to you. And he was actually proving the manifestation through science. And he talks about manifestation works because you're priming your subconscious through your default brain network, through the salient network of what is relevant or salient to you. But in your case, and what Ruth is saying, you're saying that if you pride yourself or carry the burden of trauma as your identity, you're priming your network, your brain network, saying that, oh, trauma is what's salient to you, and therefore you become your trauma. And we have to interrupt that loop.
Yeah. And there is another study, I don't know if he was referring to this or not, where there's a study that shows the Salient Network, the Salience Network is defective in trauma. And so the switching from default mode network to cognitive default is broken. Our Salience Network is broken in trauma, and rhythm-based therapies help correct the defectiveness of the Salience Network, because we do get overly identified with our trauma in that way. So yeah, I'm totally on board with that and aligned with that. And with trauma, we know that it gets defective. You know, I am my trauma. No, it's what happened to you. It's not who you are. And I can help you release that energy so you become more of who you are. And that's been my experience personally, and that's what I want to share with people.
So speaking of what happened to us, I want to go back to the beginning of your book in your childhood. Frank, how did understanding your parents' adverse childhood experience, or ACEs, help shape your understanding of trauma overall?
Understanding their ACEs was so important for me, not as a kid, I didn't give a crap about their ACE score, let me tell you. Because as a kid, I was the recipient of their ACE score. And I'll tell you, my kids were the recipient of my ACE score. And that's painful, but it's a reality that my trauma history had an effect on them because they lost their safe parent every time I got triggered or activated. And this happens over and over again. And with my parents and the awareness of their trauma as I was an adult through the healing process allowed me to hold the complexity of them. It was really huge around acceptance. Huge. And I could feel that now. Like my dad was wounded. My dad was limited because of his trauma history. He had a horrible childhood, being medically ill, being bullied and teased as a kid because he had special needs. He had a domineering, controlling mother. There's some question as to whether he was sexually abused by a priest growing up, not confirmed in any way, but just holding the awareness of the victimization that he experienced puts a context for me as, wow, I experienced him as a perpetrator, but I understand some of the origins of that being about him, not about me. And that's huge, right? When, at the end of the story, I say, why did he do this to me? To my mother. Why did he treat me this way? She's like, it was about us, not about you. And that was a huge differentiation. So understanding, and same thing with my mom, like she still struggles, and I have acceptance of her now in a way that I haven't before. Her desperate need to stay connected to my father was about her trauma history and her losing her father when she was 6 months old. And her growing up in a household where these men would come and go because my grandmother was desperate to raise 3 girls all by herself. Not holding that context is like, oh, her behavior towards me wasn't about me. Did it affect me? Hell yes. Was it about me? No. And that's the root of deconstructing shame. Right? Because shame is, I'm bad, I'm wrong. My father's treating me this way because I'm bad and I'm wrong. My mother doesn't love me because I'm bad and I'm wrong. It's like, no, it's because of their history. Yes, it affected me, but it's not about me. And that's a huge process of healing from trauma, is the differentiation of how you were treated versus who you are. And that's the uncoupling that is part of the healing journey.
Yeah, I love your choice of words on uncoupling, and also you used the term moving through earlier. I love language. And as you know, language is the most potent and powerful technologies human ever created. It's this synthetic artificial thing, allows you and I, different cultures, different age, different everything, to communicate what's the internal to the external. I highlight that because I hate the word overcoming in the container of therapy and healing. When people say I overcame my depressions, I overcame my trauma, I ask, what are you overcoming? Because whether you like it or not, that is now a part of your experience, what we call epigenetics in our field. So how can you overcome a part of yourself? You don't. You accept yourself and you move through it. And that's what healing is.
And again, back to the beginning, and you release the energy that doesn't belong to you. Yes, you still have the experience. Yes, it's part of your narrative. It's part of who you are. And it's not who you are, right? And that's an important distinction. But yeah, no, so I love words that I love words too. It's one of the things I've learned to love as a writer. It's like, oh, that word is amazing. Like it just hits you. So, you know what word activates me is post-traumatic growth. It's like everybody's like post-traumatic growth, blah, 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 blah. It's like, gaslighting. They throw around these terms, right? That is like, whatever. Here's what gets me about it. Post-traumatic growth has a feeling of bypassing healing. I wanted to say post-healing growth. That's what that's what I do say. I'm like, post-traumatic, like you have trauma and you move beyond it. You grow beyond it. I'm like, no, there's a missing step here, people. Post-trauma growth is not actually what it is. You've got to do the healing because honestly, most psychotherapies don't really know how to release the energy of trauma. And they bypass it, they go beyond it. Let's change, let's move forward. There's many people in our field that jump over trauma and grow without healing. So that's my little pet peeve around post-traumatic growth. I'm like, don't bypass the healing process here, people. There is a process of releasing trauma that a lot of people don't do. There's this neuroscience around memory reconsolidation, which is rewiring neural networks, the core neural networks of trauma, versus what they call counteractive change, which is creating a new network to override the existing, right? And so I'm a fan of healing, even if it's an activating word for people. Is it permanent? Is there such a thing as permanent healing? No. We're susceptible to being reactivated, yes. But we release what we carry and then a new layer of something shows up, right? So I'm wanting people to hold healing as an important component here, and there's a way to do that, right? That's my little pet peeve. We all have them. That's what it is for me. It's like, don't just jump forward too quickly here, people. There's something in there that's really important for us to visit, not get sucked into, but visit it, to heal it.
I had just another, I guess, visual metaphor came up when you were saying that. I think healing is like a revolving door. It's not a one-way or a bi-directional floodgate. It's revolving, right? And you talked about in your book, you said, after 50 years, I'm still healing. And you asked a rhetorical question, maybe healing will never end. But maybe that's the purpose of healing is there's always parts of ourselves we can reconnect to and return to.
Yeah. And the way I agree with you 100%. And here's the way I experience it. If I do a piece of healing work, I shed that layer of energy that was in my system, and my energy elevates to a different vibration. And then at this new vibration, I experience something which activates the original wound, but I'm in a different place now, and I'm meeting it differently, and I'm learning something different about it. And then that next layer allows me to elevate to a higher vibration. And there's no end vibration in my experience. But I don't relive the trauma once I've healed it in the same way. I'm meeting it at a different vibration. So I'm having a different learning each time it comes up. That's the way I see it. So there's an evolution of healing depending on whatever layers I have released that allows me to continue to grow. And I'm going to go maybe a little weird for people here. I don't even think it stops when we die, personally, because I think it's a soul evolution. I can feel the way my soul has grown this lifetime. Am I done growing at a soul level once I die? I don't think so. I think my soul has done a lot of work this lifetime, and I think I'm going to be in this constant evolution of soul growth. That's what I hold. And, people can hold different views and feelings in that. They don't have to agree with that, but that's the way I see that we're constantly growing and evolving. I see it in my kids. I see where their souls are at, and I'm helping them on their soul evolution journey. I'm a Sherpa, right? I'm the coach outside of the boxing ring. So I think we're all in soul evolution.
Nothing is esoteric. My background's in psychedelic science. So trust me, my audience are used to the unity, the oneness of consciousness and all that.
Yes, 100%.
I had another metaphor pop into my mind as you said that. It's almost like the more marathons you run, right? I asked an ultra marathon runner. He runs 150 miles at a time. And I asked him, now that you're an ultra marathon runner, is it easy for you to run a 26-mile regular marathon? He's like, no, marathon still sucks. I just have a greater capacity and I'm able to endure 150 miles. And that's what you're speaking of. Healing doesn't diminish our pain when we revisit certain triggers, but it just increases our capacity to endure and revisit that pain through a different perspective.
100%. I'm so aligned with that. Yes.
Like I said, I want to have a few more questions to hit you with. I want to ask you another quote from your book, and you alluded to this throughout, but I want to really zoom into it. One of your passage says that intimate relationships are often about people unconsciously seeking someone to heal their past wounds. Could you elaborate?
Okay. It's such a bummer. It's such a bummer, but it's true. It's true. When I kind of talk about this, I'm like, look, people, I didn't create this system. So don't blame me for the fact that our wounds are what drives attraction. Our wounds are what drives attraction. It is really our way of redemption. We seek somebody out who is familiar, who actually has similar wounds, and we make this unconscious agreement. I'll heal yours if you heal mine. This is what the drive and the draw to somebody else is. And typically, people are drawn to somebody with a similar wound with an opposite adaptation. I'm an extrovert, in case you haven't noticed. My husband's an introvert, okay? I'm outgoing, I'm expressive, he's internal and contained. We seek balance. So extroverts seek introverts, and we have such similar wounding and such similar histories. So there's this draw to someone because they're like, we know each other. We have the secret language, and it's unconscious, but you're going to help me be who I need to be. And what ends up happening, this is why I think there's a 50% divorce rate, is we rely on the other for our own healing. We seek them out for redemption, and then we get pissed at them when they don't fix our problem, right? The goal is, the trick is yes, let me seek out similar, because there's a resonance, you and I get each other on a deep, deep level. And I would rather have the agreement be, you work on yours and I'll work on mine, so we can share our life together. And that's what I'm in the midst of doing with my husband. Like, I'm so much more contained. I've learned a lot from his internal type of being in the world. I've grown a lot as a human being, but that's different than relying on him to do my healing work. I do my own healing work, and I've learned a lot about being in this relationship. And that's the trick for people. You know, I think we enter relationships to grow and evolve. And I think the responsibility needs to be, I'm going to choose you because you're a good person, or to allow me to grow with, not you're the person who's going to heal me. And I think people eventually get that. It's a hard one because it's largely the draw to another person is largely unconscious. So it's complicated. It's a complicated journey, but I think it's important for people to hold that awareness.
Like you said, it is hard because it's unconscious. But I think the more difficult thing is, even if you're aware, is the burdensome nature of the responsibility you have to accept. That we are in charge of our own healing. And I actually want to segue that into another thing I really appreciate you talking about. Aside from all the details and wide openness of your book writing with your memoir, I really appreciate you talking about your dad's own therapy journey, right? With the family therapist, with your mom. And here's what I mean. You talked about your abusive Italian father's therapy experience and how he did not improve his anger and physical violence towards you. The reasons behind that physical violence, it's here or there. That's not the point. I'm saying that because as therapists ourselves, I think too many people nowadays believe that therapy is a cure-all be-all. By just attending therapy a week without additional integration, without additional reflections, without additional diving deep internally that, oh, I'm paying $150 an hour. That's my work. I'm seeing a professional, am I not? But I tell people therapy is not the work. It's a navigation system. It tells you what to go and where the journey lies. But you got to walk across the bridge. And I want to bring that in because, again, your father's example is such a poignant example because he was seeing therapy and you were seeing his progressions and improvements over time. At the same time, it didn't, air quote, cure him the way people may now perceive therapy as.
So a colleague friend of mine, Lori Gottlieb, who wrote the book, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, says most of the work actually happens outside of therapy. And people get like, what? What do you mean? I thought we'd go to therapy to get all these great, pearls of wisdom so we can change. And she's like, no. It's that we can bring awareness and we can help you connect. And the work happens outside in life as you release all the stuff you're carrying, right? And so I did see that with my parents, both of them in ways. One of the things that the couples therapist, my parents saw when I was a kid, I was an individual, they were in couples. The therapist asked my dad, this code for gay back then, apparently, it was, what would you feel like if Frankie became a hairdresser? I was like, that's crazy, right? But that's the way the world was. And my dad's like, I don't care if he's a hairdresser as long as he's happy, is what he said. Now, I don't know how true that was, but years later, when I was 32 years old and I finally did come out to them, he didn't have a strong reaction. But he was beating me up as a kid for who knows what reason, right? My feminine traits, I have no idea. His own history, of course, right? I saw a change in him. He wasn't reactive in that moment in the way that I expected him to be. The other thing I'll say is there was a period of 7 years where I had no contact with my parents because I was trying to let them know I'm uncovering what happened to me in my childhood because I suppressed so much. And they had so much denial, they could not hear it. So I disconnected from them. I said, I can't grow when I'm constantly barraged by your denial. That had a huge impact on them. My dad wanted me in his life to the point that when I re-entered 7 years after having no contact, he released a lot of his views of who I should be. He accepted me so much more of who I was versus who he needed and wanted me to be. And I saw that growth in him. He was much more accepting as a human being as a result of the experiences that we went through. So, sorry, I'm going to say this thing. I know we're kind of coming to the end here a little bit, but there's all this stuff in culture and society about narcissists are horrible and narcissists can't change and you should never forgive a narcissist. I think that baloney. I think people are all capable of changing. My father was extremely narcissistic. He was. And he had the capacity to change pretty dramatically at the end of his life and in smaller increments all the way through, which I saw. So I don't want to hold a judgment about any human being as being bad and wrong and not capable of changing. Okay, that doesn't forgive the effects that they've had on you, but it also holds space for everyone's capacity for growth and change. No matter what you've been through, no matter what you've been through, I hold that firmly. I'll say one last thing, sorry. I feel strongly about this if you can tell or not. I was in Cambodia last fall and through the killing fields and being in all these camps and things and seeing these temples juxtaposed with the killing fields like a block away was so powerful to see the level of hate and devastation that our world is capable of, and the love and the kindness of the Cambodian people. It was shocking to me. How could you have transgenerationally experienced so much pain? Like, I met 5 survivors of 20,000 people dying in a killing field camp. We met one of them. Like, how do you be kind and loving after going through something like that? So this capacity we have as humans is to endure horrific and to grow and change and love and be kind is very powerful in my experience.
Yeah, I think, again, humanity is complex, and I think it's the nuances that makes us, we're not just a mammal with the biggest brain. We have limbic brain, the emotions, the neocortex, and the spiritual, right, which we didn't really dive into because of the limitation of our time. But I don't always talk about myself, since this is about the guest. In this case, I really enjoyed your memoir. I read about 3-4 books a week with all the guests, but most of them are similar tenets. I'm excited to dive deep into one of your proteges, Mastin Kipp's book, before his interview. But your book was deeply personal, and I believe in synchronicity because I'm very spiritual and religious. A quick disclosure, I got married 2 months ago with my current wife after 5 years of being together. And I went through recently a reconciliation process with my dad. I'm Korean, so similar to Italian culture, family is the pillar, period. We didn't speak for 3 years. We were on no contact for 3 years because of his emotional and verbal abuse, his lack of willingness to accept his responsibility, and so on. We reconciled and talked to each other for the first time the night before the wedding. Family dinner, and we hugged each other out. But here's what I'm trying to say. In the end of your book, when you said that when you visited your dad 3 weeks before the funeral, he was half dozed, half awake, and he saw you in his bedside, in his skeleton structure based on your words. He kept saying, "Frankie, I can't believe you're here. Frankie, I can't believe you're here." And you also thought to yourself, "Dad, I can't believe I'm here either." I'm saying this because through this mental health space that we're in, I think we've oscillated too much because everything oscillates. 10 years ago, trauma wasn't real. Mental health is pseudoscience. Now everything talks about trauma and everything's about trauma. I just want to close this loop by saying that reconciliation process is not always rosy, sexy, this peachy thing people think about. There's a lot of hardships. Forgiveness is not just sitting on a mountaintop, namaste, and I forgive. There's so much heartache. And even if you reach the destinations of forgiveness, you still struggle. But reading your forgiveness chapter, your last chapter, and your 2 last chapter actually brought tears to my eyes because it really reminded me of my own journey with my dad. And our process is still ongoing, and he's still alive, thankfully. But I just want to really appreciate your courage and your openness. I laughed in your pre-word when you're saying that I need a break after my last book. I spent 3 years in my transcending trauma. You're like, I can't do this anymore. And during your meeting with your publicist, they're like, actually, what about if you write a memoir? You're like, memoir? What? But I appreciate the work, and it means a lot. And yours was the most personally resonating book I read in the last 3 months. And I read about, again, 3 to 4 books every week. So thank you for your contributions and your calling in the space of trauma.
Thank you so much. That means the world to me. The having impact on others to help them in their healing journey is what it was all about. So thank you for sharing that. It really touches me, and I'm grateful. So thank you.
Yeah, and that gives me hope too. But to be respectful of your time, Freck, without further ado, this is a metaphorical red carpet moment. Where can people check out your book, your website, and anything in between?
Yes, so as I wrote a general public book for the first time, you can get To Be Loved wherever books are sold. Like, I love saying that, as opposed to, so it's really anywhere. Go to my website, frankandersonmd.com, and there's links to various places to buy that. I had a meeting last week. We are working on the movie rights to the book, which is super exciting for me. So it'll be adapted to the screen to reach more people around trauma healing. So that's super exciting for me. Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, LinkedIn. I'm in on all of those social media handles. Frank_Anderson MD is Instagram. And, we're a community of healers. This is not going to happen individually. So we're building a collective of people to help push that needle forward for healing. So thank you for being a part of that journey also.
And quick digital flower to Victoria for pitching you to me a month and a half ago now. Thanks for sending the book. Thank you, Victoria. And yeah, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your work and I appreciate your energy today. To all the listeners, before I let you go, if you learned something about trauma, maybe redefined what trauma and mental health means to you from Amazing Frank, I want to ask you to share this episode with one friend. Don't you want to help reshape their learning about what trauma means and help them to reconnect with their lost selves because of their experiences? And as always, I encourage you to choose love over fear and come back to the next week's train of Discover More. Thank you for tuning in.